Hey, Savina, if it's okay with you, I'm going to kick the event off. So welcome to everyone who's joining. Before we get started, I'll let you know that we're recording the session. We're hoping that we can send the recording out to those who can't attend in person. So just with that in mind, do keep yourself on mute, unless obviously we're throwing the spotlight onto you. And yes, let me welcome you again. Savina, who works with us at Smart Data Foundry, is going to be leading the event. But a big thank you to both Savina and all of our panelists. We've got Carol, Riddhi and Raluca, who will be joining us shortly, and we'll do some intros then. Before we do get started though, I'm going to tell you just a bit about Smart Data Foundry. We're hosting tonight's event, and we were formerly called the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, so you may have heard of us in another guise. We're a data innovation organisation. We're funded by a government grant, and we're attached at the moment to the University of Edinburgh. And our mission is to improve people's lives by safely unlocking the potential of financial data to enable research, innovation, and skills development in financial services and fintech. And although as an organisation we're still young, we've already started working on the topic of algorithmic bias. So just an example, our colleague Nick Radcliffe, who's on the call, he sat on the review panel for the CDEI's review into algorithmic bias in 2020. And Savina, she is leading on helping us scope out what we can do next in this area. So if you are interested to partner with us or want to find out more, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'll be in the chat and I'll put my email address there too. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Savina. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Billy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited for kind of what we have in store for the next hour. But just to introduce myself quickly, so I'm Savina Kim. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Technomoral Futures at the Edinburgh Futures Institute and the University of Edinburgh. And so to just kind of kick off the event, I'll give a brief presentation on algorithmic bias, what it is and what can we do about it, to provide us with some background, which will then kind of bridge us into our panel discussion afterwards. And so to start, algorithms and AI agents are increasingly becoming a part of every aspect of our daily life. They're influencing us from our movie recommendations to suggesting what kind of products we should buy, but then are also really heavily involved in high stakes decision making. So anything from processing loan applications to also hiring decisions, medical diagnosis, and even assessing whether a defendant will recommit a crime. And it makes sense. The growing usage of algorithmic decision making is fueled by really clear benefits such as efficiency and speed. For example, unlike people, machines don't become tired or bored, and they can help reduce costs and process significantly greater volumes of data than humans can. But the question is, as our reliance on these artificial agents continue to grow, we should also ask ourselves, what are the consequences and risks of such dependence? And so here we can see there's some highly visible real-world cases of where you have these unfair machine learning algorithms that have led to quite suboptimal and discriminatory outcomes. And so there's many instances of this already happening, and you can read about them here, ranging from bias due to gender or to ethnicity, or even skin color. And perhaps most famously in financial services was the case of Apple's credit card that was launched in partnership with Goldman Sachs. And so it was found to offer lower lines of credit to women than to men of equal or even lower financial standing. So Steve Wozniak, the Apple co-founder, had also claimed that even his wife was being discriminated against. And so this is kind of the gender discrimination that we're interested in looking at. And it's an inspiration for today's presentation on International Women's Day. And so overall, these examples show that bias predictions stem from these hidden and neglected biases, whether it's in the data or the algorithm. And so it's essential that, one, we remain critical of these technologies while also checking, our own attitudes towards them, meaning we should reflect on our own interactions with them, but also, the influences that we receive, especially in light of the often kind of faulty assumption of quote unquote like objectivity, that is often ascribed to algorithms. And I think this is exemplified kind of well in this quote: algorithms may be mathematically optimal, but ethically problematic, from Riddhi. And so just in the remainder of this short talk, I'll just cover some of the major shortcomings of algorithmic decision-making. So identifying key places where bias might leak into the modeling process, and also examine some issues, some approaches to combating this issue going forward. And then I'll close with just a brief overview of some open challenges that we're still facing today, which I think will then bridge us really well to hearing from our panel, which I'm really excited about. And so we've seen that, like humans, algorithms are also vulnerable to biases that can render their decisions unfair, where an unfair algorithm would be when decisions are made that are skewed in favor for or against a particular, subgroup of the population, for example, based on gender or ethnicity. And so the first question is, where is this bias coming from? And to answer that, we have to first understand, how does an algorithm work? So first, I'll briefly describe the stages of developing a machine learning algorithm, which starts from the data input all the way to the utilization of its outputs, which happens in this repetitive loop, right? As new data is then fed back into the algorithm, where the goal is to improve predictive accuracy over time, for instance, as you can see here in the figure. And so essentially during that input stage, the algorithm is trained using data that will then inform its resulting calculations and decision outputs. And so it's important that, if the original training data is already biased, the algorithm can perpetuate and potentially amplify these biases. Then bias can also come in during the design of the algorithm itself. For example, if certain variables in the design are weighted incorrectly by programmers, whether it's intentional or unintentional, the use of the algorithm's decision output can also then be subject to bias, and also depending on how human users then interact with with the outputs as well. And so, for example, let's say you have a probation officer who's assisted by an algorithm that produces risk ratings for offenders, and maybe without a proper understanding of how the system works, might believe that the algorithm is entirely objective or infallible, and may just simply automatically accept the suggestions without considering also, alternative assessments, such as from our own knowledge or own experience. And finally, systems are often, trained and optimized over time based on how its original recommendations or predictions are then judged by the human operators as being accurate or being useful. And so what this essentially means is that any biases that were generated in any of the previous steps can also be amplified over time in this feedback loop. And so we've seen that bias can exist in many shapes and many forms, and it can seep in at any or multiple parts of the modeling pipeline. And so here I've just dropped in 8 of the most kind of general important sources of bias. For the sake of time, I won't be able to get into them. However, there's a brief description of each type with some related resources if you'd like to learn more. But all in all, in order for us to be able to address the bias issue in these applications, it's important for us to also know, where these biases coming from and what can we then do to prevent them. And so to essentially bring this back into the real world now, why is this important? So financial services is one of those areas where algorithms are being used really intensely. And there has been quite a lot of analysis on their impact. And so we see that these algorithmic systems within financial services industry can include things from customer focus issues. So very popular application is credit scoring, for instance, or even like insurance quotes. Are also used in operations focused uses, so capital optimization, market impact, and then also with trading, portfolio management, and even regulatory compliance, or things like fraud detection. And so, for example, one of the most controversial uses of these algorithms is in payday loan companies, so many of which have become notorious recently for expanding on the type of data they use now to make those very fast and direct loans, usually and with higher risk customers that were excluded from more traditional forms of credit. And so, for example, rather than using the traditional credit score, they've also begun using alternative credit data, which can range from looking at consumption behavior based on your credit card history, all the way to even social media and the connections that you might have with others. And so, unsurprisingly, the industry has become a big focus of debate for those that are concerned with the topic of algorithmic bias. For example, according to Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Council, he says it is now commonplace in AI and machine learning that algorithms that govern mortgage lending and insurance quotes are biased against women and even more so against people of color. And so Black people pay billions in extra premiums and high loan rates, but no one quite knows how and why the machines learn to discriminate, much less how to stop them. Example in a working paper back in 2016 by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that even after they are controlled for credit scores and other risk factors, African-American and Hispanic borrowers in the US were considerably more likely to have higher cost mortgages than Caucasian borrowers. It's interesting to note here that the authors didn't attribute this difference to algorithmic bias. Instead, they had suggested that, okay, well, members of these groups are also less likely to shop around for mortgage products and therefore more likely to pay higher prices. And so I think this example also illustrates and another important kind of challenge for people, for those that are working in this field, which is also that difficult task of, disentangling biases that are caused by an algorithm, but then also, bias and unequal outcomes that are caused by other factors that may be influenced by the current state of society, by our history or just the institutional design. And so even in cases such as financial services, the subject is very much still incomplete and emerging. And so kind of the next question is, what are people doing about this now? And so in order to solve this fairness problem, first, it's important to know how do we identify it and then how do we measure it? And so researchers have responded to this by developing an ever-increasing array of fairness metrics, trying to quantify fairness in decisions in hopes of eventually mitigating it. However, creating these generalized notions of fairness is quite challenging. There's many different ways you can interpret fairness. And there's certain metrics that may emphasize the individual. So every individual should be treated equally versus looking at group fairness, right? So these subgroups of women versus men. There's definitions like statistical parity, where each group receives an equal fraction of possible decision outcomes, or other definitions like counterfactual fairness, which then states a decision is fair towards an individual if it coincides with one that would have been taken if the sensitive variable was switched or different. And kind of to make matters worse or more difficult is that it's often impossible to satisfy multiple definitions simultaneously. So there's no universal means to measure fairness. And another issue is that sometimes increasing fairness can also result in these trade-offs, such as lower predictive accuracy or other related performance metrics related to the model. And so it makes it also difficult to kind of make that choice between different competing priorities. And then kind of another interesting direction that researchers have taken is introducing tools that can assess the amount of fairness in a system. So you have Etiq, which is a toolkit that lets users test models with regards to different bias or fairness metrics, produce user-friendly reports. AI Fairness 360 is another popular open source toolkit that was developed by IBM. And then there's other companies like Etiq that are trying to create software platforms for businesses in order to identify and mitigate these biases. And so all in all, these toolkits can be helpful for learners, researchers, and those working in industry to develop fair machine learning applications by trying to limit this discriminatory behavior. And so in summary, we've seen that kind of research in algorithmic bias is quite challenging. There's many open questions about, one, how do we identify them? How do we measure and then mitigate these biases? How do we then define what kind of fairness we want in society? And then, how do we handle then the consequential trade-offs that might occur when you're prioritizing fairness? And so just to close, here I list also a few other outstanding challenges in the space. And so one is, understanding the shared societal risks that might emerge with algorithmic bias. And, how should we go about appropriately balancing these liabilities across those that are involved or those that are impacted, so across the different stakeholders. And in other words, also who is responsible for ensuring compliance of these algorithms with existing policy and law. Lack of common terminology is another one, right? So you needing this common vocabulary for discussing these issues is just beginning to emerge. And I think this is particularly pertinent with algorithmic bias, which can affect many different types of technical systems and different types of applications across different industries. And then next is also the difficulty in understanding an algorithm's design due to proprietary tools, as well as accessing the data in which the algorithm has been trained, because oftentimes companies may be very protective of their data sets as they are with their algorithms. And this can essentially leads to another issue, which is also determining the quality of historical data that an algorithm may be using, and having a limited understanding of then how these biases existed, what types of biases may have existed at the time of collection, right? So the way that historic data may have been collected by different institutions or governments or police authorities, for example, may have been significantly influenced by official, unofficial policies at the time, or even individual decisions made at the time of collection, which is quite difficult or maybe impossible to detect after the fact. And so these sources of unintended bias at collection is also critical to kind of understanding how can we then maybe fix it. And so essentially we've seen say that, with the popularity of AI and machine learning, these concerns over safety and fairness constraints have arisen to become a big kind of ethical, social, and also political issue. And it involves, researchers and engineers, from those who are designing these systems all the way to the policymakers and regulators, who are then also tasked with ensuring its responsible use. And so this brings us to the part that I'm most excited for, which is our panel discussion with our invited speakers to help us gain a bit more clarity into, how can we overcome these challenges going forward, and also get a sense of what is being done in the real world about these issues. And so thank you for listening, everyone. And now, so maybe just before we begin our discussion, I'd like to ask, our panelists to go around, maybe give us a short introduction about themselves. You can tell us a bit about yourselves, or maybe like how algorithmic bias feeds into your work and interests. And so Raluca, maybe over to you.
Hi, hi, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me today. I'm Raluca. I'm a data scientist. I've been a data scientist for quite a while now. And I'm also a co-founder of Etiq, which is a startup that kind of tries to tackle this problem of algorithmic bias. We're now building toolkits that can help data scientists identify the problem as they're building the algorithms, and also not just bias, but also a whole host of other problems that they might have, and which usually are linked to bias as well. So yeah, that's me.
Amazing, thank you. Riddhi, do you want to go next?
Hi everyone, Riddhi Sen. I lead our data science, intelligent automation practices capabilities at Capco UK. Capco, for those of you who are not familiar with us, are a consultancy firm, and we specialize in financial services.
Great. Carol, would you like to go?
Hi, yes, I'm Carol. My job has actually changed since the slide. It hasn't before that. I'm head of data culture at NatWest. among other things, I'm working on data ethics and AI ethics with our data science community, and hopefully rolling out across our entire modelling community fair controls in the application of data science, so right through from data source or before data sourcing, concept data sourcing, model design, building, etc. So I'm working on that. My background is law. I am not a data scientist, although I sort of say the odd thing that's probably wrong, so you can correct me on that. I have a background in law, as I say, on data protection and equality as well. I chair the UK Finance Working Group's ethics group, which is a trade association for the UK banks, and also been feeding into the European Banking Federation papers on AI for the draft EU AI regulation. And also, just of note, I am a tutor on the postgrad LLM in IT law at Edinburgh on one of the modules with Professor Schaefer, for anyone who knows him, who's pretty well known in the university. That's me.
Great, thank you so much. Let me stop sharing my screen. And so I guess next, I mean, I have some, we have some few questions prepared that we'll just go around, and whoever wants to kind of chip in can start the conversation. But all in all, I think it's nice just to have informal discussion and kind of get all these different perspectives on these issues. And so as the first question perhaps is, as we've seen, despite all this progress towards identifying biases and designing these fair algorithms, I think one of the problems is translating them from theory into practice remains kind of a major challenge. And so what do you think are perhaps the best next steps for approaching this theory to application challenge? So in other words, what is the role of organizational composition and structure for ensuring fairness in AI outcomes, or what kind of processes maybe need to be established to help minimize bias in AI applications? Perhaps Riddhi, would you want to kick it off?
Sure, absolutely. And actually, going back to Carol's introduction, I should say I'm not a data scientist either by trade. I do have a background in mathematics, which I'm hoping will take me through this call. But for any technical questions, we're just going to point it to Raluca. Let me take a crack at this one. And really, it's a lot of it is around the impact in financial services, especially, or as to what the model is making. So in Capco, we are doing extremely sort of cutting edge type models, but they have more of an impact on people's lives, careers, actually, in certain sectors versus others. I'm just going to put two examples in front of you and then tell you how we work around mitigating the bias. So one is, say, predicting revenue against large corps. So, I'm working with a number of banks, and they want to predict value for large corporates that they have in their portfolio, and based on historical data, we're able to say, these are the ones that you want to focus on, and these are the ones that perhaps you want to manage yourselves out of. That's one example. On the other side of the spectrum, we're working with insurance firms who are coming with health data, and they're saying, can we start predicting which people are going to fall sick so that we can manage their claims? As you can see, it might sound like similar problem statements. Outputs and inputs are completely different. We get one wrong, not that big a deal. We get the other wrong, it's a massive, massive problem. And so we have to as practitioners, we have to be very careful of the responsibility that we have when building these models. And you touched on a lot of the points, Savina, that is there enough historical data? Is the historical data representative of the population that we're going to impact? And then when we're building the model, quite frankly, we are talking to, so many people who have an input. So, we never sit in a silo and build a model. We're working with the business, we're working with the customers, we're working with, anyone who is touching front line, second line, third line, and getting their inputs as to what makes this process a fair one. And then on top of that, we'll never have a single person building the model either. We will have a team, and this team will include business experts, 2 to 3 data scientists at least, and it will go through the QA, QC processes. And by doing that, we can take out some of the systemic bias that an individual might have when building an algorithm, or someone might particularly miss. Because again, when juxtaposing those two different examples, the impact of one can be horrendous, while the impact of the other is, a bit of a financial crisis, perhaps. Anyone want to add? All right, Savina, back to you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Raluca, did you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think kind of highlighting the impact is very important, and yeah, I just want to say I think it's a tricky process, right? So I think maybe it's kind of you see how this impact can happen, and I think from a consumer point of view, you kind of wonder, like, why isn't anyone kind of trying to do something about it? But it's not an easy problem to solve, I would say. So, it's possible to solve it, but it's not super straightforward. So yeah, that's kind of my added point.
Yeah, I guess especially you with Etiq, like creating a platform to try to debias and kind of find these things. How do you see that kind of working, I guess, maybe within your own organization, or how do you see that kind of helping other companies or that are trying to look to do that, trying to look to unbias their kind of models or data sets?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of, we've been doing this for a few years now, and I think we've kind of gone through some cycles with it. And I think the sector overall, like the research sector, also the practitioners kind of have gone through a few cycles. And, what we're kind of seeing now is that a lot of the things, for instance, you're mentioning around the metrics, we think they're still very useful indicators. But it's very unfair to ask a practitioner to really rely on them, because they really are not aligned. So, optimizing for one will decrease the other, guaranteed. So it's not like, using them as they are is not really the way forward, but we think they can be used as indicators of risk for a model. And yeah, I mean, just as a general kind of statement, it was very unclear maybe 3 years ago how the area of like the research and the practitioners could kind of come together, and the gap can be bridged. And I think since then, people have realized that, algorithmic debiasing maybe is not necessarily the way forward. Maybe it's around this kind of balanced approach to what's going on in the model and what's going on through the whole process, from before data, even from like when you decide who you build your product for. That's a big, that's going to guarantee some bias of some sort later on. So it's very much about like having much more than just the technical community and just everyone involved, but a lot of it is still reliant on the technical community to really do something about it. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
Can I comment, Savina?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's just a slightly different lens, maybe. And I think when I was thinking about some of the questions that you had sort of suggested, without trying to sound pejorative, it's normal to discriminate. It's normal to show bias, and we shouldn't sort of take the view, and I'm not suggesting anyone is, that we need to eradicate bias, because we can't. We all have it. We all discriminate, which I guess from my days in employment law was a bad word. Discriminate is not a good word. It has negative connotations. People do not like being accused of it or suffering it, obviously. But in some respects, it's choosing between and among options. It's discerning, which is maybe a better word. So we will have to make choices, and we do. Yeah, we have historical bias, absolutely, in society, and how far those models and private organisations can go in the absence of a socio-economic duty being triggered by the Equality Act in society is something that, is a difficult question. What I do think, though, is there has never been a better time, probably in history, to have a go at this and to tackle the biases in history that exist in data and that exist in as individuals, and to help not just those who are covered by the sort of protected characteristics in things like the Equality Act, but looking at things like special categories in the GDPR, the consumer duty that's coming for finance to share products and services that are of relevance to customers. There are all sorts of opportunities. There are also constraints though, because in my opinion, my personal opinion, there are tensions between and among some of the legislation like the GDPR and the e-privacy regulation, which again is in draft, which is requiring consent to have electronic communications from an organisation to a customer. That's going to be difficult if you're trying to comply with a consumer duty. That's going to be difficult if you're trying to make sure that the 9 possible protected characteristics are covered. And I think maybe, Savina, you maybe touched on it in your opening sort of preamble, that we don't have a lot of these categories. They don't exist. We don't collect them. We might be able to infer them. Probably shouldn't do that. It's probably unethical as well and probably wrong. And does it help? And what about the whole awareness of customers and consumers in wider society that this is going on? Because when you think about it, it in some respects seems a bit odd to be having the conversation when I know the Equality Act's 2010, but it goes back to the 70s, really, the origins of it. And old sort of directives from the EU or the European community, as it was when I studied it back in the 90s. But we've never had a time when we've had it so good, really, as they tell us. We can do something about it now, and we can look at not just historical bias, but I think maybe it was Riddhi who mentioned the early warning indicators. So hopefully we won't be getting litigation coming down the line. We'll be getting early warning indicators, and we can make decisions to intervene and have tolerances to try and manage bias as far as we can. But I guess per organisation doing that by itself is difficult. And I think you've asked about what sort of things do we need. Some degree of common standards. I won't say any more because probably treading into other question areas now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think that actually might lead us quite well into the question between, I think everyone has kind of touched on, there's always these trade-offs, with one kind of maybe comes at a loss of another, and how do you go about balancing kind of impact and these kind of values and priorities and other interests across different stakeholders that you mentioned also, Carol, also looking at the consumers downstream. And so that's maybe, with having to always balance between these different stakeholder interests and needs, ranging from regulators to managers in industry, to also, the computer scientists that are kind of on the ground designing these, and then those who are most impacted, who are the consumers downstream. How do you maybe envision stakeholders then being able to cooperate with one another going forward, or kind of being able to balance these concerns and liabilities and priorities? Does anyone want to jump in first? Or
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm have to kind of
carry on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so yeah, I'm happy to kind of have some thoughts on this. I think once again, I think it seems like a kind of a tough situation we're in, and obviously these things happening are very bad, don't get me wrong, right? So it's not a good outcome to continue them happening. But I think for a long time we maybe thought that wasn't really a way forward in terms of standard aligning and so forth. But I think now we are, similar to what Carol was saying, I think we are starting to see things converging a little bit. There's definitely a strong appetite from technical teams to at least start looking into these problems. And not that they weren't looking at it before, but to kind of just delve a little bit deeper. As a result, this kind of idea that with, if you think about it, people do want to kind of solve the problem, but also they do want to do the best job possible. And I think maybe what we've been missing so far, and we need to add, is this idea that if you solve for these biases, it's not just that your consumers are happy and unharmed, which should be a major objective for you, but also as a business, you're doing the best job possible. Like your system works well, it's robust, like you're not missing out on opportunities, and it's not, you don't run into any compliance issues. So I think the moment we start reporting on this a little bit more is the moment where it'll become much more clear to businesses how important that is to themselves rather than as a trade-off, if that makes sense, to kind of their performance, let's say. So yeah, I am a little bit more optimistic than maybe I should be, but I am optimistic. I think businesses are starting to understand how bias and similar issues, cause, ultimately revenue loss, and them harming consumers kind of a two-way street in a way. It's not just a, one-way street. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, just to add to that, from a business perspective, it's actually taking a lot more, it's a lot more impactful to look at what were previously untapped groups of consumers or untapped groups of consumer interests, and more businesses are looking that way, right? So in financial services, both in the banking, from a banking standpoint, like a retail banking standpoint, as well as from an insurance perspective, more and more companies are asking, how have we dealt with our vulnerable clients? And the answer is not very well so far. It's because they're an overlooked group. We don't have a lot of historical data against them. They haven't been very participating. So just because we don't have the training data, we haven't included them. And again, we're losing out on a huge potential market, right? And then where now we were on, today is a great day to talk about it, women investors, right? Women invest a lot less historically than men do, and so there's a huge untapped market there. We are looking at ESG investing, like socially responsible investing, and again, a lot of that is a huge untapped market, but consumers are moving more and more that way. Businesses are moving more and more that way. So it is actually now counterintuitive to business and strategy not to look and incorporate these previously untapped areas into their models and into their strategies.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with this, really, and that's what we saw as well, like especially some of the examples you gave with the female investors and so forth. It's, yeah, they do want to invest more, or they want to invest in riskier assets than maybe they are labeled to want to. Yeah.
You mentioned, Riddhi, that vulnerable customers, which I guess in banking as well, and I'm thinking, I know you work in that sphere, is difficult, and that's where some of the tensions lie as well, because it's not everybody who wants to be labelled either vulnerable or who wants to disclose it, and you can see it in data, but how far you can realistically use that is something that I think is probably not necessarily understood by consumers in society. And obviously, again, certainly in financial terms, the vulnerable definition extends beyond that in the regulation in the equality space as well, into financial vulnerability and health, which of course is in that sort of space, but it's slightly different. And I guess it's becoming, we have almost the duties really to the individual rather than necessarily vulnerable or not vulnerable. And of course that these conditions as well are not necessarily permanent. They are transient often as well, which makes things a little bit different from the sort of the commonplace ones that we sort of try to protect, the protected categories. And as I say, there's quite a few tensions, I think, in the regulations, which we will have to make some kind of decisions about. It certainly looks as if further regulations possibly unlikely, albeit I know there's the UK is looking at the data protection sphere, and we've got the complication of Britain with Brexit now. We'll probably have sort of two regimes, and also doing the right thing ethically, which will inevitably, I think, conflict with regulation at some point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Carol. I think, and it's really funny from going to recognition of a group, and I mean, women have been in this for centuries now, if not millennia, from going to recognition of a group to labeling a group and then putting, to your the first point that you made, we all have biases, right? So taking out race, gender, definition of vulnerable. Obviously, from a modeling perspective, we have to cluster these groups. But then again, from a labeling perspective, what do those words mean? And when we talk about a woman, a vulnerable customer, what is happening in our minds? You're probably seeing something different than I am, and that's true. We both bring our biases to the conversation. So it's really, really important especially when you're building an algo to reflect all of those, or to not reflect them, and then that's also going to evolve over time.
You're right, and we could be having a conversation as we are now, and we might both be interpreting it quite differently, and yet we think we're in agreement. And I was actually speaking to a data scientist stroke philosopher today, who is, I think, quite unusual. He has both sides of the fence. He's really a translator, and we were talking about the characteristics, the categories. They're not the same as data points. So you might have a cluster of data points that give rise to gender or to sexual orientation or whatever the category happens to be. And it's a different way of looking at it. And I think a lot of people in my space, certainly in the sort of privacy sort of type community, don't see it that way. They just see you shouldn't be using it for anything. And that, while it's one view, maybe doesn't take us further down the equality route.
Oh, sorry.
No.
But no, you're absolutely right, Kara. I mean, we do see this debate a lot as well. I think, obviously, from someone who's looking kind of from the angle of algorithmic bias, it is, significantly harder to pick up on things without this information. But then it does get to a point where, should people re-engineer this information if it's not available? Like, what's the level of consumer consent that the consumer would be happy to give if they knew that this is actually the goal towards which the information would be used? And I don't know, I mean, each person is different, right? So you would need consent from all of them, kind of. That's the point of it. So yeah, it would be great to get some standard steering in this regard. It's not clear to me what the legislation is. I mean, maybe other people more knowledgeable about regulation are more familiar with what its kind of guidance is, but it is a confusing topic for practitioners.
I wonder if people would be more willing to share the information if they knew of the consequences. Now, Savina, I was trying to hear without my glasses at the screen when you were showing the paper about, I think it was African American, Hispanic American mortgages being more expensive. So I was thinking of like the poverty premium. Are these groups even aware that they are potentially being impacted by a poverty premium? Do they know that? If they knew that, maybe they would be more likely, or we're not really asking for it. I suppose there's a number of issues. Are organisations and products and services structurally biased in themselves in accessibility, potentially leaving aside the economic issues that together, if you conflate those two things, it just perpetuates consistently the bias. And needing to have that data as well. I'm thinking of the Apple example and Goldman Sachs. The number of people I've spoken to when I've said actually Goldman Sachs didn't discriminate according to the investigation, most people think they did because they didn't have the data at the time. They took so long to get it. The investigation took so long that it's become an urban myth that they did discriminate. And then you've got other organisations like I think Lyft, the taxi company, who did have the data to be able to show that they were sending taxis to sort of poorer areas when they were sort of being accused of not. I guess it's having the data and being able to prove one way or another as well, which, and I know some people who would prefer possibly just not to do it, just to carry on as we are in society, but because it's such a big problem, or potentially a big problem. But it's a great opportunity as well, as I think somebody was talking about, might have been Riddhi, bringing in groups that are previously disenfranchised or not even banked maybe in certain cases.
Yeah.
I'm going to take your opportunity. Oh, sorry, Raluca, go for it. I'll come in after you.
Not sure if I'm adding much, but yeah, I think a lot of the bias work itself can be used as kind of almost indicators, like what is why is this product not attracting people from more diverse backgrounds? Just like, which people is it? It's kind of it's kind of like a mirror sometimes, like what's happening there. And some decisions are intended, but others are not intended. And then it's like, how do you reverse them? Totally.
I think one of the questions in the chat relates to this discussion, so I just wanted to highlight it. The question is, a basic way to minimize bias would be to remove gender and race information from training data. How would you explain that bias still occurs even after you removed these? Because the discussion that you've been having is all about, well, actually, we've got a lack of data to prove bias. But the question here implies that having less of that information might be more helpful. I mean, yeah, your thoughts. Can I go to, let's go to Riddhi. We've not heard from Riddhi for a while.
I've been yapping my own ear off at least. So from a modeling perspective, Raluca, I'm hoping you'd be able to help me out on this, right? But I don't think that solves our problem, because let's say we were talking about disenfranchised groups, and the individuals, if you look at them as on a row by row basis, right? Again, if they're not included in, say, banking historically, they will not be included in your list anyway. So we were talking about the whole data set vis-a-vis the different attributes. Now, there's some obvious use cases out there where actually I was reading about this study done in the University of Bath, where somebody has within the model to look at underprivileged and to look at undereducated or underemployed, has said women are significantly going to be higher in these groups, and they were as part of their algorithm included that bias. So that's obviously, that's an obvious situation. But at the same time, having the data speak for itself is, I think, also important to say, and that's how you recognize which groups might be, clustering towards a certain segment versus not. But again, to Carol's previous point, it's so important to look at individuals in their own right, and to understand the groups that you might be able to help with a certain legislation, but also what we were talking about before is just groups that are not included in the data overall, which attribute or no attribute, they just don't have a footprint. Raluca, perhaps you can take this one from a modeling perspective.
That's exactly right. I think the other issues that it doesn't seem like taking the demographics out of the model will help improve on those indicators that we're talking about, and no one kind of can decide whether they're right or wrong. And the reason is because you have other data in, right? So most of your data, especially in situations that matter, like lending or justice or recruitment, are very linked to the demographics. So if you have another piece of information in there that's essentially almost as if you had gender in, then it's like, well, okay, you took gender, but you still have 5 other bits of information left that could, impact the decision. And the problem is, I mean, I don't want to go into this too much. The problem is where do you, so, lending is income. Income could be, correlated with gender, maybe not as much, but, there is an income salary gap, let's say, wage gap. But then do you take income out of a lending model, right? So this is where it gets what's the rule now? What, where did, and, to be honest, it does seem like an unsurmountable problem, but at the same time, a lot more work can be done to bring it to a better level. No one's expecting perfection, but I think there's still a gap in terms of how do we deal with these things while still providing fair opportunities or fair outcomes for everyone, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, in terms of businesses, we might, by taking out attributes, obviously, given privacy, you would be taking out certain attributes depending on whether individuals say yes or no. But if businesses want to still get that information, they'll start inferring it from the data that they already have, and they'll say these 4 or 5 attributes, if they start showing up like this actually, the probability is this is a woman who is, underemployed, etc. That can be even more dangerous, quite frankly. So we just need to be very careful as to how, the standards, back to the point, the standards and the outputs and the applications of models that we put in use. Carol, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, every time someone says I go off at another tangent or down another hole. I was just thinking about one of the questions on the screen. I agree. If you take it out at the beginning, whether it be race, gender, whatever, you've kind of lost sort of obvious sight of it, and it will creep back. As you creep back in, there'll be other attributes. Somebody was asking about, if you take it out, is that kind of gone? And I was talking to someone today about, the bias can really, I think, occur in the discovery phase with sort of structural bias or exclusion bias. I'm thinking of the example, we talked about structure a minute ago, about the one in Boston where you could report potholes on your smartphone, which kind of meant that it was mainly a certain demographic who had smartphones, and then the roads where they lived were getting fixed and other people's weren't, which sounded like a good idea at the time, probably. So that's even at kind of discovery phase. And then you've got sourcing data, you've got inaccurate data, it's collected badly in the wrong format, it's incomplete, there are fields that are empty, different systems don't talk to each other, you've got missing records, you've got the whole representation bias point we talked about earlier, and then you've got data quantity. I guess it's easier for bigger organisations with large data sets, assuming they're representative of society. You can buy vendor models that will have pooled data, for example, on fraud and financial crime, that you can get your model trained on a wider pool of data. So while that might look like, you think, oh, why would you do that? It's actually potentially safer. I think a lot of things that look potentially bad are actually quite good. There's the data being out of date, how long have you had it? There's the whole proxy bias as well, and there's the whole redlining example in the States that's kind of as old as time. Labeling bias, there's sort of legacy bias, the feature selection. I was going through a list here actually about validation data, and then you've got things like data drift and concept drift. There's lots of places along the value chain, I guess, where bias can creep back in, and I guess some of it is similar. It leads to unfair outcomes potentially. The one about dropping income from lending is an interesting one, which could lead to all kinds of huge societal problems. And we all know that, no one's suggesting it. But again, it's, the Equality Act was not designed to achieve equality. And the government is not, I don't think, requiring lending organisations to lend irresponsibly. We know what happened in the past and has happened previously. I don't think it's straightforward. I think maybe I was talking a little bit earlier to Savina about this the accessibility in helping groups who are maybe excluded to become included or to get better access is possibly a better way forward. And I know, obviously, going back to Smart Data Foundry's kind of genesis, data for good, can help highlight or shine a light on some of the inequalities, I guess, and I guess direct government policy and maybe new regulations. So I think there is hope. And I think the work that you have done, certainly that's in the public domain and we have worked with you, has been valuable. Things during COVID, which has been a real time where we've had to do things potentially that have been accelerated and have created quite incredible good. And then there's models as well that don't work during a period like COVID because they were trained on different data. People are behaving completely differently. And they fall over, which is again another issue, and not maybe reacting too quickly and trying to have tolerances in the models. But rambling now, but somebody mentioned this reciprocation of the relationship. The customer has to get something out of it. We need to address data asymmetry so that they can have more transparency, I think, in what's happening. I think that will come. I think that obviously we were talking about it 2 or 3 years ago. Calls like this weren't happening in the world generally, and they are now. So I'm quite excited about it, to be honest. I think we can do a lot of good and do a lot of good for a lot of different groups and individuals.
That's really great. That is a really good conversation. I know we're quickly coming to the end of the hour session, so maybe I'll just ask one last question, bearing in mind a bit the time, but I guess, from this discussion and kind of the reflections that we had here today, maybe what would be the most helpful now kind of going forward for kind of companies and institutions and researchers to ensuring more fair performance going forward? Like, is it a question of having more stringent regulation or ethical frameworks, or, kind of that consumer awareness and demand? And maybe it's all of it, but yeah, maybe kind of in your opinion, briefly, like, where should we be going next with this, or what is kind of at the top of the to-do list of kind of trying to solve this problem going forward? Really good. Do you want to jump in really quick?
Sure. I think from my point of view, like, all of these things would be great, all of the above, but I think like a lower hanging fruit is kind of kind of just general awareness, and just kind of focusing our technical teams to look at this as a risk for their systems, because I think they look at so many other risks, right? So this is yet another one for them to really consider. And I think once we're in that frame of mind, I think it'll be much more easy to start talking about it and to kind of just put some, at least some good reporting in place. That's the first step forward. If you don't know, what any of these metrics are, then you really, even if they're contradictory, like, you don't know them. So how can you change things, or how can you infer things? But yeah, that's the one for me. But I'll let Carol really talk more about it.
Just very briefly, because I've spoken quite a bit. I think I think for once, not starting, and this is my own view, sort of looking at what definitions of fairness are, maybe not giving up on it entirely, but looking at the definition of fairness and what metrics might be required in a given use case, build up a repository and see how multifaceted and how many dimensions there are to fairness. I don't think it's what people like Aristotle necessarily wrote all those years ago and meant really well, and I really enjoy reading, but I've struggled to put into practice. I think it's for me, it's a kind of unholy alliance of maths and language, and I think that's a really difficult thing that's probably not been foreseen, and it's something that I would love to see happen. So I think translating between those two disciplines to be able to demonstrate sort of defensible fairness in a given context, and possibly maybe we will arrive at that definition, that elusive definition of fairness one day.
And as soon as we arrive at it, it'll change again for Aristotle. But I do agree with all the points. I think conversations like these are really important. The more that we have, I think all three of us, and I hope for some of you in the audience as well, this has brought to light our biases and the challenges that we when we don't actually check our biases that we might be having, or the lens that we might be having. For me, there's one that's much more long-term as well, which is to introduce more and more people to technical streams. So, we've talked about women in STEM, but it's about everyone in STEM actually, and how fundamentally how from the very, very early ages do you encourage more and more people from different walks of life to become mathematicians, modelers, to build the technical solutions of tomorrow. And so when we all sit together in a room, we're not representative of one portion of the population, but we're checking each other's biases, even and not just from mathematical perspective, but also from the social, economic, gender, et cetera, discrepancies that we all have, and we should celebrate in a room, and we can challenge each other even more.
Amazing. Those are great responses. Thank you, everyone. I know we are now finishing off. Bailey, over to you if you want to.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to all the panel. Thank you to Savina as well. Hopefully we can keep in touch and continue working on this. But I'd like to say I've learned a lot from the hour, and what a great panel to have on International Women's Day. I can't tell you the number of events I've gone to on similar occasions, which have been a lot of this, and this feels much more practical, much more technical, and much more interesting. So thank you so much. Lovely. I will wrap up there, and we'll follow up with everyone with a recording. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.